And this is Chuck Wolf, and you're listening to WPKN 89.5 FM, listener-supported radio in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Today, I have a guest who's going to be talking with me about neuroscience and the role that neuroscience plays in emotion and dealing with emotions. And since the show is the emotion roadmap, take the wheel and control how you feel. Today, we're going to learn some ideas about how neuroscience itself contributes to coaching and to emotional management, emotional empathy, and how sometimes emotional empathy conflicts with trying to deal with tasks. And since my show is about trying to help you pick the emotion that works best with whatever the challenging situation is that you might face, it's really important to understand, I think, physiologically what's happening to you, not just the techniques of coaching that I've talked about. So I'm excited to have Tony with us. Tony's got a very strong background in neuroscience and psychology and philosophy. He teaches at Case Western, and I happened to meet Tony through a fellow named Richard Boyatzis, who's well known in the field of emotional intelligence. And Richard was on somewhat recently in talking about his book. Richard has developed this philosophy or this methodology of an intentional change theory. And so some of what we're going to talk about today is about this idea of coaching for compliance, which is often how coaches come into an organization. Somebody in an organization needs some help with something. And so their approach is to come in and help fix that. That's different than coaching with compassion, which is how to be the best possible version of yourself. What is your personal journey? Who is it you want to become? How do you become that person? How do I help you do that? If you don't mind, Tony, tell us a little bit more about your own background, how you came to this. And you want to make, there's some key points that you want to make this morning with our radio listeners. So I'd appreciate it if you'd share what those are, and that's where we'll start.
Thanks very much, Chuck. Well, it's a pleasure to be on and to talk to you. You're really an expert at the applied side, and my background is is much more to have come from the ivory tower. In fact, both my parents are professors. My father's a neuroscientist, my mother a philosopher. The earlier part of my career has been around this huge new revolution in understanding the mind that's come about because of advances in brain imaging technology that have really given us a window onto the mind in action that we didn't possess before. And as I came to Case and I had the opportunity to lead my own lab that was looking at those questions, really a big sort of picture emerged, kind of a view from 30,000 feet of something very significant about the structure of the mind that has not been fully appreciated in psychology. There are lots of suggestions of it in both the history of philosophy and psychology, but it's new. It goes against the sort of the mainstream consensus that had arisen in psychology. As I've been sort of taken by that and trying to make sense of it. Also, I met Richard when I came to Case, not long after I came to Case, and here was this wonderfully kind of enthusiastic and engaged person who was really looking at how could he help people by applying academic ideas. So that's been a very fruitful and enjoyable collaboration, and Richard's really kind of helped to show me how I could do that myself. So that's what I'd like to do my best to sort of distill some of these kind of ivory tower ideas into something practical, and I think talking with you you'll help draw me out. I'll rely on you for that.
I think so. Actually, I've been very intrigued with just the one paper that you wrote, award-winning paper, by the way. And it was written with Richard Boyatzis we're talking about. And again, I'd encourage people to get his book, Helping Others Change It. Richard is a wonderful idea, is full of enthusiasm, is a great person to be around, and so well read and so knowledgeable about the field. It's great that you made that connection. And as I was looking at what you're doing, as I read about empathy and task, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about the domains and how inside your brain sometimes the domains work well together. In terms of, there's a part of your brain that really focuses on empathy and feeling what others feel, or understanding at least how others feel and why. And also when you need to get something done. And, you know, and always I'm thinking practical. So I'm wondering, so in times of like what we're living with with the virus right now in the COVID-19 pandemic, and all the people who have lost their jobs, and the empathy that causes people to feel about that, and yet the task orientation that says, how do I get back? How do I open safely? Everything's new. Everything, you know, how much can we clean? What's deep clean mean? How can we be safe? So I'm sure people are flooded with empathetic feelings, their own survival, whether especially small business people. And so they're struggling right now with this domain conflict. And sometimes I was fascinated to read that sometimes one domain actually shuts off another domain. So as you're feeling more stronger feelings, it actually causes you not to be able to focus on task, or vice versa. So I'd love for you to spend a few minutes talking about that, Tony.
Right. Great. Thanks. Yeah, I think what's really striking in the brain is this division we see in reason. And actually, for a while, I was so sort of struck by how powerful that division is in the brain, where if you engage one type of reason, you really turn off the other, like a seesaw. That I was very struck on the idea that it was conflict. There was a constant battle. I now have come to think that's not really a very helpful way of talking about it, at least usually, because yes, there's sometimes a battle, but when things are working well, you might not even notice there's a division in reason because you're trading off so smoothly. So I think a nice metaphor for this is like a family or a marriage. Of course, you know, many partners in a marriage have different goals and they'll come into conflict from time to time. But if your main focus is that they have different goals, maybe that they have different gender styles, if that's your main focus, you've missed the main point of a family, which is to work together in harmony. So I think there's a similar issue here with what's happening in the brain. But that said, it is far more than gender differences. There is a very, very big difference in these two centers of reasoning in the brain. And one of the most important and surprising things about this is it does not fit our everyday intuitive model. So we really need to update that. There's one big message I got is we need to update our everyday intuitive model of reason versus emotional, reason versus passion. That's how we tend to think of things. We tend to put things in those two buckets. You know, there's good, clear, detached, cold reason. And then there's these hot emotions. And that certainly both of those things exist. But what we see in the brain is in fact, there are two centers of reason. So there's one that's more to do with being rational and cold and detached. But there's another type of reason, which is what we use when we understand someone else's point of view. And I call this empathic reason, but I think it's important to understand it's not empathy in this just simple emotional sense. It's actually a very sophisticated type of reason. It's what we use for ethical thinking. Immanuel Kant pointed out there's an important division between theoretical reason and what he called practical reason. So Kant pointed out that there's one type of understanding we reach when we just get a dry, abstract understanding of of what the facts are in the world. But there's another type of reasoning that's tremendously important, which is how do you decide what to do? That's practical reason, and that's the domain of ethics. It's also about, you know, figuring out what is right to do, what is desirable to do. So that type of practical reason brings in that divide. Doesn't exactly map onto this divide in the brain, but there's a type of reasoning that's quite distinct from the sort of detached scientific reasoning, and that's something I found about a decade ago now. And I gave people tasks where they either had to solve scientific puzzles or they had to understand what was going on in the minds of these two people who are interacting and make some kind of comment or prediction about what they were going to do. And what you see when you do that is you push the seesaw to either extreme. So when you're engaged in scientific reasoning, you completely shut off the brain areas for empathic understanding. And when you engage in empathic understanding, vice versa. So you really can push the seesaw to either end. And I like to refer to this now as the poles of reason. And it's not to say there isn't. Lots of reasoning involves some combination of these two things, these two ways of thinking. And the brain does indeed constantly move back and forth between these two things. And in fact, we know that's a signature of health. You want to be moving all the time between these. And when you're not, that comes up in a number of different mental disorders, plus in lower IQ. So you really want this division between these two types of thinking. You want this trade-off. Rather like when you're walking, you want to be using one leg than the other in a regular way. Hopping is not tremendously efficient. So, and it's really a sort of similar sort of biological phenomenon we see in the brain. Constant trade-off between these two ways of thinking. That's healthy function. So what I've been doing now for a while is sort of exploring how that model can shed light on a variety of different things, all the way from kind of conflicts in thinking, paradoxes or philosophical problems, to the much more practical everyday matter of how we can be effective in managing ourselves and others.
So let me see if I can say, let me see if I can put something concrete around this. So I was struck by the fact that your mother and father had two different professional lives, in a sense, in terms of what they did for a living. And so one version of empathic reasoning is you wanted to please them both, so you became them both.
Right, sure.
Right.
I clearly identified with both of them, right? Yeah.
So I mean, so that's one level on a personal level. The other is I'm thinking of Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx, who are the two main doctors in our country, who have tried to use the scientific past focus, what's happening with the virus, to explain to the general public. And yet President Trump, whether he's been successful or not, has tried to come in and also give people hope, and somehow try to emphasize. I imagine every leader in every country is doing something similar. I just don't know as well. But I'm just trying to see the balance of the domains in real life in a practical setting. So while he may not have been as successful, I think the early versions of that was, we are going to develop a vaccine. We are going to beat this. It seemed to me that's empathic reasoning, trying to give people some hope in desperate times. While the doctors were more talking about, hey, we've never seen this before. This is brand new to us. This is the evidence that is fact-based, trying the best they can. They made mistakes, both of them in some ways, in terms of what they were saying, because they didn't understand it as well as they tried to understand it. But it seems like, at least for me, just listening to you, those would be some ways of thinking about that in a concrete way. Let's take President Trump out of the equation, because he's a hard point. But the idea of a leader, it seems to me, is that you want. So I mean, what Churchill did in World War II. I mean, it's the idea of trying, even in desperate times, to emotionally understand how people are feeling, or Roosevelt did during the Depression era. Just that we can come back. We can do this. Somehow a belief that we can do this during wartime, rather. So,
absolutely, and it's much easier to talk about historical figures. It's less controversial.
Than when you're in the middle of it. But I think whether he got it right or not, that's what I thought he was trying to do.
Yeah. Right. I mean, I think this is absolutely right, and Richard often talks about the concept of resonance. So the idea that you can identify with the emotions that others are feeling, like a lot of fear right now, and that you can then weave a narrative which puts those emotions within a context and helps people to see, well, in your terms, what the roadmap would be for those emotions to evolve. And that is I think one really important way of understanding empathic reason. That is, empathic reason works with emotion, but it also puts it into a larger context. And a narrative is one of the paradigmatic ways of understanding that. So we tell each other stories. We live by stories. We live by an idea. What is the story of your life going to be? What do you want it to be? What is your vision for it? And then what kind of honestly is it, right? And this idea of thinking about the arc of your life and the arc of other people's lives. The arc of justice is a big theme that's come up recently. So these stories are really important to us. We're very moved by stories. We live by them. And I think the important thing to realize about stories is that they are deeply involved with emotions. They help to frame emotions. They help to both recognize the emotion of the moment and to see how it can evolve, and to help people to evolve that emotion. And I think that's what a great leader is doing. They're putting things into a context and telling a larger story that will help them cope with their current experience and their current fears.
So when do you, what's the signal, do you think, that suggests that you're in a situation that calls for empathic reasoning? What do you think is a way of alerting people to the fact that you want to get out of the task focus? That a lot of leaders, in my experience, tend to be promoted because they're such good problem solvers, and which is a task orientation typically. And they struggle sometimes when they move up to strategic roles, and they need to understand how to be more about changing a culture, if you will, which I would think would be a form of empathic reasoning more than it would be necessarily task focused. Although once you, I see them relating in terms of, I know what I want to create. I have this idea of emotionally what I want to create, and then it becomes task focused, and how do I get there sometimes? Does that make sense?
I think problem solving as a sort of general type of activity that leaders and executives are involved in all the time, that applies to both domains. But empathic problem solving is about people. It's about figuring out what's the right thing to do. How can I identify the right narrative that plays into the best emotions, that makes the best of everyone here, while acknowledging what they're struggling with. So that's a type of problem solving, certainly, to come up with a good narrative that's going to help change the culture, as you say. It's rather different from, running a simulation, running a model. I recently read a story in the New York Times. You brought up Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx. It was about how Dr. Birx had been quite optimistic that we'd bent the curve, partly because she was relying on a lot of modeling work, so very abstract, theoretical kind of science. And Dr. Fauci, meanwhile, who certainly believes in that type of work, had called up a bunch of centers, and he'd got the feeling on the ground from people who were leading some of these medical centers. And he was much less optimistic because he was hearing distress, and he was hearing that it felt out of control to these people. And according to this story, at least in the New York Times, there was a tendency to dismiss what Dr. Fauci was saying because it was anecdotal and because it didn't correspond with what the administration hoped was happening. Whereas they listened very much to Dr. Birx because it was what they wanted to hear, and it was, backed up by really good science of a certain sort, this kind of very analytic modeling science. I mean, I think even in this very short history of the last 6 weeks, I think we know who won, right? It's pretty clear we haven't bent the curve. We've got skyrocketing cases. Fauci was right to be really nervous about the idea that we had got things under control, and the idea that things were bent down and that we could really relax was just not. It may have been, the models may have said that, but that wasn't really how things have played out. So I think that's a good illustration of how even good science really requires one to balance this kind of more experiential point of view where you do listen to anecdotes to some degree, right? You get the information from that, and you balance that against a more logical, detached way of thinking. I think in current society, we are so impressed by and enamored by the sort of our technical abilities. You know, technology is extraordinary. It's amazing what it's achieved. No one can argue with the progress of science. And that makes us kind of double down on that, on the value of that way of thinking. But in the end, you know, being effective really requires a balance. You can't just focus on the technical. You need to keep an eye on the experiential. And I think that's very much true for anyone who's running an organization. I mean, there's the bottom line, there's the logistics, there's the technical details that a good leader in many cases needs to have mastered, or at least to have a good general overall understanding of. But then there's the feel of the culture, there's what's going on, the different currents of how people are interacting and feeling. And if you're not tuned into that, it can be a big problem.
There's, I guess, you know, partly the whole COVID-19 thing isn't just about a health issue. So you also then include the politics, right? So you have the Times, and you know which way the Times leans in terms of the stories that they write, and you know, and the curve in our state where I live in Connecticut has gone down. I mean, the curve has been great. I mean, we're actually, I give Governor Lamont tremendous credit for the way he's managed this, and we have like, it's, you know, Trump has this wall thing on the southern border, right? But I think we're going to have all these states in New England want to put walls around all of our states now, not let anybody in.
Well, I just went out to the East Coast, and it was notable to me how the compliance with sort of CDC recommendations and people social distancing and reliably wearing masks. I mean, not perfectly, but reliably wearing masks. And that we're not seeing that there's been less of that in Ohio. So, I mean, I think it's clear we can bend it, but it's very dependent on human behavior. And that's where you need the empathic, that's where you need to be kind of switched into how are people thinking? Do they believe that wearing a mask is, I don't know, there's clearly a lot of sentiment that it's a kind of unnecessary restriction on their freedom. And I think that's a narrative that came up early on and that fits into a very important narrative about the American experience and not being, you know, not just following what everyone else is doing, this kind of individualistic idea. So it's a very important American narrative that we have freedom and independence.
That's right.
And so I can see how that narrative has taken hold, but it's also like a rather troubling narrative when you see how effective it is if everyone wears a mask. So I think that's one of the problems we're tackling.
And the science is all over the place. I mean, like the virus was going to be, is going to slow down with the heat and the humidity, and it didn't.
Right.
And the early version of mask wearing was that it wasn't necessary. Right. It didn't do anything. Right. And now people are saying cloth masks, not so sure, even though that's what everybody's wearing, whether it's really making a difference, like an N95 mask, what makes a difference. Yeah. So I think it's, I think there's a lot of emotion. Again, politics enters into it. So let me move to a different arena. So it's not, because I think the politics colors this one. But what about, you know, when somebody goes through layoffs, do you know Carrie Churnis, by the way? Have you met Carrie?
I'm not well, but yeah, I've met him. Yeah.
Well, yeah, Carrie's just written a book, Leading with Feeling, and it's just a lot of interesting strategies about how people deal with rationally with emotionally charged situations in a very emotionally intelligent way. And he's captured some really neat stuff. And one of the things he writes about is the idea of layoffs and how when you experience a layoff, it's not anything anyone welcomes necessarily. But in your language, I think you have to be very task-focused when you're thinking about how to lay people off so you don't incur lawsuits and you protect your company from liability. You also want to make sure, if you can, that what happens to the people doesn't cause people to badmouth you when they leave. I mean, you want to be thinking about that too. That's a task focus. And then somehow, to some degree, people feel as though emotionally you want to do the right thing for people. But one of the things that you write about is how sometimes you've got to sort of not feel the emotional part because it can contaminate the other part. Like if you want to say something to somebody about, I wish I didn't have to lay you off, let's assume you said something like this, that I had to choose between you and Jim over here. And Jim has a family and kids going to college, and that's a lawsuit as soon as you start talking like that, that you kept Jim because Jim had more need than you did, because you're single and you're younger and you can go out and find something easier than Jim could. And you're trying out of an emotional feeling of trying to make it understood as best you can. So that's one potential hazard, why you want to keep the emotion at bay. Put it in sort of like a little box inside your head and not deal with it until later. I had a boss one time that said, when people are laid off, don't talk to them. Don't do it. You don't want to feel what they're feeling, because you want to, as best you can, just pick up, what you need to pick up, because when they're gone, there's going to be a lot more for all of us to do. And we have to focus on surviving, and then we can thrive again. And so the more you're talking to the people that just got laid off, the harder it is sometimes if you can't manage that well. And so it was a protective strategy, and I appreciated it, but I also thought, these are people I care about. Yeah. So I wanted to talk to him, but he wasn't wrong in terms of how it felt when you did talk to him. Mm. And yet people, when they're down and out, really appreciate somebody reaching out to them, because most people don't. Mm. So I mean, there's all these complications of, how do you separate the empathic reasoning and the task reasoning when somebody's being laid off? And in Carrie's story, he said one of the things that he suggested he saw a leader do was explain the rationale for why the company had to do what they did. And that's a great point, I think. But it doesn't always hold, because sometimes the only reason people do this is because they're greedy. And they didn't have to. We had a layoff at one point in one of the companies I worked for in a year of record-breaking profits, and nobody saw it coming. And people made choices like buying a new house, picking a very expensive college for their kids. They had no idea they were going to be unemployed in 3 months. Yeah. Because somebody decided that, hey, we just realized that we have a higher ratio of people of this particular function to the number of people in our business than other companies. So we probably don't need that. So let's just lay them off anyway. That's a real hard one to justify. So I see the constant pull in making the organizational decisions. Which product line do we keep? Which one do we sell off? Because it doesn't fit who we're going to become. It fit for a long time, doesn't anymore. So this whole group of people are gone. All kinds of situations that were, years ago they used to say, leave your emotions at the door. But those were the reasons why. They didn't want you to have to feel something when you try to make analytic, good, hard decisions necessary for a company. And yet now we're seeing this idea of emotional intelligence isn't the absence of analytic reasoning, it's the combination of analytic and empathic reasoning working hand in hand. So your thoughts about any of that in terms of how it actually plays out?
I think that's really helpful, Chuck, because I think it really, that's a practical way of talking about this tripartite division that I really want to make sure people understand that, there are emotions are there, and then there's analytic reason and there's empathic reason. And as a leader, we don't want to lead from emotions, but we do really want empathic reason to play a very big part of how we lead. Not all of it, but we want it to play a big part. And one reason for this is analytic reason doesn't work with emotion. All it does is suppress it. That's the relationship you see in the brain. There's very little crosstalk here. That's why we think of cold logic. It's detached it's detached from emotion. Now that can be very useful sometimes, in particular if you're very caught up in negative emotion. That's where we really suggest that, a good dose of detachment of analytic thinking can really help. And we talk about that with a coach as well if the client's getting caught up in negative emotion. But that's all very well, but if you look at those brain areas, what you don't have is any reliable long-term regulation by engaging analytic thinking. So analytic thinking will suppress your emotions in the short term, but it will do nothing to kind of fix them or help iron them out, right? They'll still stay there bottled up, and then they may explode out later and sort of hijack all of reason. Empathic thinking is how we modulate our emotions. So that's like this larger narrative. And so, I think this is, you were talking about different narratives for a layoff, and if the true narrative is greed, sure, you got a problem. All you can do is go to analytic reason. Like, let's not talk about emotions. If there is a perspective from which anyone could understand why you needed to do the layoffs, then part of your important work is to communicate that perspective and to express your regret that that is the reality, right? And by doing that, you're going to really help other people in the organization, and hopefully, at least in the long term, maybe they can't acknowledge it right away, the person who's being laid off. So, to do that work of trying to find a way to communicate how, however difficult what is happening is, that it's not being done out of coldness, it's not being done out of greed, it's actually being done to preserve something like the vision of the organization, and that it's being done with as much compassion and care as is possible given the circumstance, right? Those are things that are very powerful to communicate. And I think people who sort of say, oh, just stay away from the emotion, that's fine. That's an understandable strategy if you're not very good at doing the empathic part, right? And that's something that people tend to go, they rely on this naive idea that there's reason and then there's passion, and I don't want anything to do with passion. I'm a reasoner, and so I'm just going to be cold and detached. And what happens is that they can suppress the emotions for a bit, but then they explode later. When we first started talking, you said, you suggested to me that at some point we should talk a bit about anxiety, and I can well understand that because we're in a very anxious time right now. And one thing that we do know is that in terms of being able to modulate sense of threat and anxiety, these brain areas, the analytic brain areas, they don't do anything. The only way that you can get rid, and this has been even shown in rodents, in animals, is where animals don't have very big empathic brain networks, but they do have a part of the brain called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, or a homologue of it. And that is the area that is essential for helping fear extinction, is what they say in sort of conditioning terms, but helps to calm anxiety, helps to calm these emotions. And that's what we see, that people who don't suffer from fear and anxiety have better connectivity between these empathic reasoning areas and areas like the amygdala than people who suffer from a lot of anxiety and depression. So it's this way in which there's crosstalk between a larger narrative, a larger story, and these sort of basic emotions that are sort of evolutionary ancient. That it's that crosstalk that really helps you to regulate your emotions in the long term. The analytic way of thinking is it's a quick fix. It's just like, let's get rid of the emotion, let's just suppress it. But we know from decades of work in emotion regulation that suppression, while it's important and effective, especially when you're in the moment of having to act, it is an important strategy. But it's a very unhealthy emotion strategy as a long-term strategy.
So you write about ethics, you write about happiness, you write about conscious capitalism, I saw too. And one of the things that strikes me is, some of the, the idea of we want socialism that's running rampant through a number of people in our country, as a way of reacting to what I would consider is interesting, and I wonder about your thoughts about this in terms of how it actually plays out, is I think any of the isms, whether it's capitalism, socialism, communism, any of them, I think can be corrupted by greed and power and wealth and the overwhelming need to focus on just for yourself. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know that I'm a fan of capitalism, but I hate greed. And I think that I think when you see people, you see companies today that have taken money that that didn't need it, like the money got doled out to take care and to keep people alive. And there are small business people that, really desperately need that money. And then some big, small businesses, if you will, who have taken that money because they're connected, they know people, and they game the system, and they got the people that can fill out the paperwork quicker and get it in faster. And it's like, why would you do that? Well, why would you take the money that you don't necessarily need, except for greed, of course? And I'm wondering, with all the different kinds of things that you work on, whether it's this empathic reasoning, because that's very task focused. It's all about me. I don't think it's about caring about anybody else. But it's also, in my mind, at least unethical to a degree, even though it's able, it's not illegal, but it seems unethical to me. And it's not about being a conscious capitalist. It's being unconscious in some ways to me about the impact of what you're doing. And I'm just curious about your thoughts about that.
Well, I think there has been this kind of simplistic equation between capitalism and the free markets and a kind of self-serving, greed-oriented way of thinking. And that's actually, that equation was really supported by economists. Particularly in the 80s in the Chicago school, there's a model of economics which really sort of embraced a self-serving point of view. I think perhaps where we and Richard have like a lot of congruence, a lot of resonance, is in the importance of a vision that goes beyond serving oneself. And so yeah, I think the whole question is, how do you make a capitalistic system, which is a very effective system in many ways, but how do you make it work with an orientation that isn't self-serving? Because I agree with you that any of the isms are sort of problematic. Like an extreme capitalism has, to some extent, descended into a kind of embrace of the greed is good sort of mentality, which is not helpful. And there's a way in which, at least at the extreme, socialism actually removes autonomy from people to try and go out and construct something that's better for everyone. It's sort of like, oh, the government will take that over, but who's the government but another collection of people who hopefully are trying to create something that is a vision. So I think really the whole trick is finding a good balance. Certainly we need to capture people's autonomy, to encourage people who have a larger vision, and want to help things work better. They need to have freedom and autonomy, and that means you've got to allow some people who are motivated by greed to succeed as well. You can't go around like policing it at a detailed level, but you want to set up a system that does, on the whole, encourage people who are doing something for the greater good. So yeah, I don't think the isms help, but I do think a more sophisticated idea of what an effective form of capitalism is.
So when you talk about, because also you wrote about this, what happens in the brain when you're trying to coach people to be the best versions of themselves. And so I also think about how do you coach companies, how do you coach individuals at the highest levels to be the best versions of themselves. And so you talked about the connection between when you're coaching for compassion and what gets activated in the brain, and also when you're coaching for compliance, when you're trying to fix something, and how it's different. And I wonder if you talk a little bit about that, because I think that's a really important part of your work. And I know people, not everybody's a coach, but I think often we all are in a position where we're trying to help somebody grow in some ways. And I love the quote from you listed about the Gestalt therapist that thinks of it somewhat as an art, not just as a science. When you're trying to work with others in therapy or in coaching, it seems to me, I think of emotional intelligence that way. At some level, if I'm trying to help people to feel a certain way, because it's in their interest after we've talked, that's going to help them to be the best version of themselves. How do you do that? How do you motivate them? And in part, you want to know how the science of emotion works. And you also want to know how they work, what's unique about them. And that's the art for me. And so when you think about it, and you think about the science of what you're seeing in your lab, what shows up when you're trying to help people be the best versions of themselves. Along the way, you want to fix the things that are broke because that helps them to be there, but you don't start with what's broken, let's fix this. And what's the difference in the brain in terms of how that impacts an individual?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes all the way back to Aristotle and the idea of living a purposeful life, and also relates to sort of different conceptions of happiness, where we're often caught up in a hedonic idea of happiness, where you're just trying to maximize your own pleasure and minimize your own pain. And that's the kind of self-serving kind of capitalistic model. It's long been known that there's a problem with that. It's sometimes referred to as the paradox of hedonism, which is aiming for your own pleasure and reducing your own pain. It's not actually a very effective way of increasing your pleasure and reducing your pain. Aristotle suggested a eudaimonic approach to happiness, which is to say a purpose-driven, larger vision that goes beyond yourself to something that you want to achieve in the world that impacts other people. And one thing about adopting this kind of eudaimonic, purpose-driven view is it actually, in the short term, often means that you reduce your pleasure and increase your pain. I often say to my students, you doing a college degree right now may not increase your pleasure and reduce your pain, particularly as we're coming to exam time. However, it is part of a eudaimonic kind of goal. So, and it turns out that if you're attuned into that sort of purpose-driven way of thinking, you tend to be more successful actually at even increasing your hedonic happiness. So I think it's very important that that is facilitated for people, and that people in coaching, I think everyone has to come up with their own narrative, but one of the things you can do as a coach is encourage people away from sort of just self-serving kind of values and towards more eudaimonic values, more like find your purpose in the world that yes, looks after you. I mean, that can't be ignored, but which also means that you're contributing to something bigger than you. And as people work on a narrative like that, as organizations work on a narrative like that, it may have some short-term, it may not get you there as quickly sometimes, but in the long term, it's a much more effective strategy, and one that I think is not only very effective for the individual in the sense that it gives them a much more secure sense of happiness, a sense that there's a life I can look back on and feel proud of. I can feel good about this life. But in an organization as well, it means that you're identifying something that people can rally around. People don't rally around, let's make the CEO happy. I mean, they might do that in order just to sort of survive, but that doesn't really produce sustained motivation in people. But to work for an organization that's doing something that you believe in, that can produce much more powerful motivation, I think.
So it's sort of aligning your values with what it is that the organization's about. Doing the things that, one of the things that I've recently read about happiness is that there's like several different types. One is just doing the things that just you and your family or you and your friends, or just and being kind with others, but not having a greater need than that, just simply living each day as fully as you can with the people that surround you that you care about. Another version was when you are doing that, plus you're using your strengths in meaningful ways. You're playing to the things that you feel are special about you, that you can contribute. And third is when you're doing something for an overall larger goal than yourself. Somehow you're contributing in a way, whether it's to a charitable event of some kind, or you're working to make the culture of your organization a more kind, beneficent culture, or you're working to make the world a more civil and respectful place where people can dialogue and freely discuss different points of view without name calling and shouting at each other. Whatever it is, and this logic. So, but I've also thought to myself, I've been trained for years, when I was a therapist years ago, to be non-judgmental. And so I don't put like a value on any of those. I think everybody seeking whatever level works for them is fine. And because somebody works for the greater good of others. I mean, Woody Guthrie was an example. I don't know if you know the singer.
I'm not well, but yeah.
But yeah, well, he was a union organizer, and he fought for the rights of migrant workers and all kinds of people in lower levels of jobs and at the same time, he was never home for Arlo, his son. You know, he gave up the family time to go do that. And so to me, it's, again, you can't, I don't judge people. People do what they do. And then you try, in my mind at least, to help them be the best versions of themselves. That's why I like the intentional change theory. You know, when I first heard about it, it was like, I'd been taught years ago to try to help people be the best versions of themselves as a way of helping them to grow, because, you know, it's the legacy exercise. When it's all said and done, what do you want said about you? And people write these glorious things. Well, are you living that way today? So those are the things that will be said about you. And then there's a reality check about, well, I say family is the most important thing, but I seem to be spending 90% of my time at work or on work. So maybe I got to rethink some of that somehow. But one of the things that you've mentioned is about the idea of when you're doing this, at least when you're writings, was that you activate when you're, I think, doing things, at least for others, or something kind that you're doing, whether for yourself or others, that there's this, it seems like the empathic part of your brain seems to be highlighted more than the task focus.
Well, I think, you know, the book I'm working on, the title is The Mind's Essential Tension. The thought is that we really need to balance these two ways of thinking. Adam Grant has written a book called Give and Take. I don't know if you've heard of
No, I haven't.
that. And he talks a little bit about this kind of issue, and he talks about different types of givers. And there are some people who their desire to give just kind of overrules any looking after themselves. And these types of givers usually can't sustain giving as long as people who have a bit more of a balance. Yes, they give, but they also, it's not that they disregard themselves. They look after the goose that lays the golden eggs, if you like. And so I think that's, I love your description of these three areas of ways in which we can be meaningful and purposeful. And I think it is very important to remember the everyday and the local, because one can get sort of bent out of shape by just aiming at the big goal, the big kind of grand aim or vision. Yeah, that can be a very difficult life, and it can mean, as you say, that you end up disregarding or being cold to the people immediately around you in the interest of pursuing that goal. So,
you know, is there some ways that you can strengthen, you know, like if you want to build your abs, there are certain exercises you can do at a gym. Is there some ways you could strengthen empathic reasoning? Because I guess as most people get task focus. I mean, it's sort of like we're forced into having to solve problems every day of our lives, some bigger than others, some long-term, some short-term. But empathic reasoning, it's sort of like it sort of happens on occasion. Some people seem gifted with it or intuitive. It just kind of comes about. But is there any way that you build that aspect of yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really think this is what we should all do more, because, as you say, some people are always going to be predominantly analytic and task focused, and that's okay. But that's not to say that they don't get a lot of benefit by just having a bit more empathic, building it up. So I think there's lots of strategies, and they're gonna differ by the individual. I think one sort of, at least it begins oddly passive, is loving kindness meditation. It's just to focus on the idea of wishing well to other people as a way to kind of get that system, you know, give it a little kickstart. I think mentoring and coaching, picking someone who you're going to make and forming a relationship where you're just going to say, my goal here is not to serve any other means. This isn't about networking. This isn't about anything instrumental that serves me. I'm just going to pick some small part of my life. Maybe you only meet someone, you know, once a month or something, but to have some projects that are just purely for some broader purpose. And those can be of many different sorts. I mean, I think of some sort of service or charitable work. I think that's a great way of fostering it. But in the organizational setting, I think encouraging a bit more of a culture of coaching and mentoring can be one way to help that come along.
So those are interesting choices. So a kindness kind of meditation where you wish others well. In some ways, in the faith that I'm in our services, we are always asked when we do a prayer for health, who is it that you want to mention? Is there anyone's name that you'd like to bring up? So that there's a focus on that person somehow, conceptually and mentally. And yet, there's also, I think, my wife has a strategy where at the end of each day before she goes to bed, she thinks about what she's grateful for and the people in her life that she thinks about and focuses on. Some people I know pray for different people every night. So I don't know if the spirituality come into this as a strategy.
Oh,
as well?
Absolutely. I think spirituality, and I have done some work on that, but I mean, I very much like the idea that what is common to most spiritual and religious traditions is an empathic core, is the golden rule, and those practices are tremendously important. We know that people who are spiritual or religious tend to have higher emotional intelligence. They tend to live longer. They tend to be better psychologically adjusted. And I think all of this is true because at least in most religious and spiritual practices, there is a lot of emphasis on leaving aside materialistic concerns and connecting to a kind of spiritual empathic way of thinking. And that's great for us, great for our health, great for how we are with others.
So I want to thank you for spending some time with me this morning, especially, you know, under this idea of empathic reasoning. I think isn't a simple concept. I mean, it sounds simple, but I'm not sure that it's simple in practice. And one of the things that, you know, when I on this show, on this radio show, on the emotion roadmap, is the tagline is "Take the wheel and control how you feel." Mm. And so when I think about how you want to feel, a lot of times that's in the empathic area in terms of the feelings you want to create and why you need to create those in yourself or in others. And also at the same time, it becomes task focused. How do I get there? How do I get from? And so to me at that point, at least in my head, the hemispheres are kind of working together to try and understand, well, that's what I want to feel because that feels right to me. And it's often when the reason the emotion roadmap comes up is when somehow people are stuck. Smart people get stuck, and when they're stuck, it's almost always because something emotional is holding them back.
Well, I love the idea of the roadmap because I think there's another metaphor that I like, which is of a cycle. And I think, you know, when you say control how you feel, I mean, I think you mean it in a very positive way, but sometimes people try and like literally in the second control everything about how they feel. This doesn't really work. You need to respect the idea that there's a cycle, or as you say, there's a roadmap. You can move from one emotion to another. But a very important part of that is that you can sit with the emotion initially and acknowledge it before you can move on. So yeah, I see that as very much like this empathic way of thinking, and it's a great metaphor.
Well, that's probably a good way for us to end. Well, anything else that you might want to say that you felt we didn't cover, or just something you want to mention before we close?
Chuck, it's a pleasure to talk to you, and you know, I really appreciate that you've led a career where you've worked on how to help people by translating this. So it's always a pleasure for me. As I say, I come more from the ivory tower, and I'm wanting those kinds of ideas to have some more impact in the world, because I think they can help. So thank you for the opportunity to talk a bit about that.
Well, I'm not sure if it fits with any of the work that you do going forward, Tony, but if there's something where the ways I think and what I'm doing might be useful with what you're writing and what you're experimenting with, I'd love to participate with you if you ever want to call and just talk about it.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I want to just thank everybody who's been listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. And I'm on the first and second Wednesdays of each month from 12 noon to 1 p.m. at WPKN 89.5 FM in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and streaming on WPKN.org. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.